Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be looking at some perspectives around satellite and satellite markets. And with me to discuss it is Mau Rodriguez, part of the Kagan analyst team who covers broadband. Mau, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Eric. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. Satellite is such an interesting area. Certainly, we've seen a lot of the public market stuff, the publicity that's all around it, but there have been some interesting transitions in terms of what's taking place. I guess maybe to start off with, can you give our listeners a little bit of background in terms of what the market looks like and what you see just in terms of who the various players are?
With satellite broadband, particularly the consumer-facing one, it's pretty much a mixed bag. We have the legacy operators who use geostationary satellite technology, and they're the ones who've been consistently losing subscribers. So it's because there's not a lot of consumer interest when these operators impose data caps, have limited capacity, and persistently increase prices. So those are EchoStar and Viasat. But there's a new player in town, not new, but relatively new, Starlink. And Starlink uses LEO satellites. They're the biggest one. They are the one that dominates, I guess, the satellite broadband sector. And Starlink has been pulling subscribers left and right across the country. And they're the sole reason why satellite broadband, at least for B2C, has been growing in terms of subscribers.
And there's this guy, Elon Musk, you might have heard of, who's running the company.
Yeah. Elon Musk is pretty interesting because he's quite close with the new president. And so with the new Trump administration, I'm curious to see how he would influence policy, broadband policy, federal grants such as BEAD, especially knowing that he owns Starlink.
Well, you bring up an interesting point. Before we head down there, I want to quickly just do some background. As far as the geostationary markets, this is something where I think many of our listeners may be aware of really what had been a lot of that large diameter satellite dish sitting on your house kind of thing that has been the geostationary market. And the whole idea is you've got a small number, single multiples of geostationary satellites that have a view and that they're in an orbit in which that same satellite is always in view of the antenna that happens to be linking to it. Now, geosynchronous or geostationary orbits are really way out in space. You're talking significant altitudes. And as a result, there's a significant amount of latency and limitations on capacity. You're bringing up LEO satellites, the low Earth orbit. They're much closer. They're, in that 500-ish mile kind of range. And they're in an environment where that latency is much lower. And the constellations there in the satellite environment is what gets referred to as a constellation. There are lots of them orbiting rapidly. So the amount of time that any one satellite is actually going to be in view is pretty limited. But there are so many of them that you've got good global coverage. So you accomplish similar kinds of things to the geostationary environments, but you've now got what is this web of orbiting satellites that you're working with. And when we think about the total numbers that are up there, what Starlink, we're discussing it, how many satellites does Starlink have to make this up?
Yeah, about 7,000.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But the idea is that you're also relaying data not only from Earth to satellites, but satellite to satellite. Satellites are able to hand off capacity. They're able to link across each other and relay across space. So there are a set of advantages in terms of how they potentially can operate and some benefits in terms of where they fit. It is an interesting market in terms of what they're able to cover and how they're able to address it. But as you're pointing out, Starlink is probably certainly the best known of any of the options that are out there. What do you see as some of the other players that are there within that market?
Yeah, so for OneWeb, I believe they have over 600 LEO satellites, which pales in comparison to Starlink. But with them, their satellites are positioned a bit higher than Starlink. So they don't really need a fleet of thousands of satellites just to provide global broadband coverage. And then there's Telesat with Lightspeed, and they're still building out their fleet. But I think right now they have about 200 satellites, mostly for backhaul services. But I believe Telesat has contracted launches with SpaceX to deploy their satellites around 2026.
So, all right. So more that's building out. Well, and actually, I'll bring in the other one that people might have heard of, which is Amazon and their project Kuiper. Although we're talking about Telesat and Eutelsat being in a sort of a growth stage, it's still fairly early days for Project Kuiper.
The company has said that they might launch their services sometime later in 2025, and they have over 3,000 satellites planned. But there is no news yet about pricing or anything specific like that. But what we do know is that they could potentially offer speeds of up to 400 megs for households.
But they've got to get there first. I guess right now they've got 2 test satellites that are launched, and they're in line for some additional launches. I guess their launch partner is the United Launch Alliance. They've got Atlas V launch that's in theory coming up somewhere in here. The problem, though, is that my understanding is each Atlas V launch only launches 27 Kuiper satellites. So they're going to have some catching up to do, I guess.
I believe Amazon also has, is it Blue Origin? Which would help them, it's just like Starlink with SpaceX. They have their own space company.
But that's also relatively early days. I guess they just launched the New Glenn, and I don't know when they're expecting to actually get it online. I haven't heard any dates about when they're expecting to start New Glenn launches. Have you?
No.
Yeah, we'll have to see where that goes. But it's interesting. Again, they've certainly got potential, and we'll have to see what happens in terms of that launch schedule and the cadence. The thing is, though, my understanding is it, much like Starlink, they've got to get up into the hundreds of satellites in order to get to an operational capacity. So it's clearly is going to take them some time to get that going.
Yeah.
What do you see? I'm curious about the market perspectives. What do you see in terms of that kind of LEO satellite approach, a la the Starlinks and any other potential competitors? How do you see that playing within the broadband market more broadly?
Well, I think there's a lot of demand for these LEO guys because there are so many rural areas that need connectivity. They also need consumer choice, especially with sometimes it is costly to build out cable or fiber broadband to those areas. And also emerging markets could use the help of LEO technology. But with Starlink dominating, that wouldn't be the most competitive. So there definitely needs to be a variety of choice for these customers, whether households or enterprises.
Thinking about sort of the build out of rural broadband, this is something where a lot of that capacity has been driven by some government programs to help fund that. Things like BEAD funding. And the challenge, I think, was that initially Starlink, there were some technical qualifications that you had to have in order to qualify for that funding. And Starlink didn't qualify for that, right?
Yeah, I think Starlink ran into some problems at the very start of the program. But knowing that Elon Musk is quite close to the president, that could change.
We'll have to see what happens going forward. But
yeah, and we know that I believe Project Kuiper won some BEAD money already in one of the states that have their BEAD plan approved. And Kuiper hasn't commercially launched yet, officially at least. I'm quite sure Starlink is, they'll be fine in terms of federal subsidies. Yeah.
I mean, they certainly, in terms of subscriptions, they seem to be doing well. It seems like they are, at least in some markets, at least a challenger to other broadband technologies. It sounds like some of the biggest challenges right now are pricing. Is that what you see as the primary competitive factor in some of the consumer deployment models?
Yeah, I think pricing is a factor, but also speeds, which is why, a lot of people choose fiber because they say that fiber can provide gigabit speeds. and satellite is not there yet. But I think in terms of, for example, if we zoom in on the satellite broadband sector, a lot of the competition would lie on price wars, I think. So whoever could provide the best value for money, then they would win, especially with Kuiper coming in.
Yeah. And I guess the question then is what's that competitive positioning between terrestrial, which is, I guess, mostly fiber markets today? It seems like we're continuing to see the evolving dominance of fiber as the primary broadband delivery mechanism for most consumer broadband that's at least not satellite based. How do you see that market today? Is it primarily fiber based?
Well, right now, cable is the king of broadband. If I'm not mistaken, yeah, they dominate definitely the market. Cable has at least 80 million broadband subscribers versus, let's say, the telcos that have just over 30 million. That's fiber and DSL lumped in together. So fiber is already there, but cable still wins for now.
Oh, by a really wide margin. That's fascinating. Interesting to see where that market goes. Is that something where there's additional fiber build out, or is this still something that's going to be evolving over a longer time frame?
Yeah, I think it's in areas where there is fiber build out, especially with a lot of these operators have marketing themselves as pure play fiber and just offering gigabit speeds. So, there's a lot of consumer interest in that. And we know that in the US, at least, there are subscribers. The uptake for gigabit speeds is faster than any other broadband tier.
Oh, interesting. So I guess it's demand at that high end. It seems like that competition with gigabit, if there is that demand for gigabit, it seems like that's something that the satellite market isn't going to be able to address. Is that something where satellite starts to get towards that, or is that always going to be the benefit of the terrestrial approach?
I think for now, that is the competitive advantage of these wireline operators. But with satellite broadband, their market is usually the rural areas. And so they're the ones that cover areas that these wireline broadband operators don't want to build out internet to. I think they have their own specific markets to address.
So it really winds up coming down to an issue of whether or not there's fiber capacity or fiber cable capacity that's built out. And if they can reach you, I guess it's something where urban centers, more densely populated areas make a lot of sense for the various terrestrial providers to be able to get to. And the rural markets are going to be that place where the satellite providers are going to be able to dominate. Again, where there's less sensitivity for whatever those top end bandwidth requirements are. Interesting. Where do you see the market heading? What's the direction that it can take? What are your thoughts on that?
Penetration in the US, broadband penetration is at, I believe it's 89% only. So there's still a lot of ground to cover. And, those areas are the isolated regions. And they're the ones who would benefit more from a satellite connection than waiting to have fiber or cable be built out to them. I think we need satellite broadband in order to bridge the digital divide.
So I guess we're in a situation where the terrestrial markets can handle as far as the economic imperatives are willing to take them. It seems like, though, that the satellite market has continued to be fairly expensive. Is that something where we look at either optimizing or reducing costs in satellite? Is that maybe subsidies to support access for those parts of the population that can't go direct? We're curious about where that goes and how we look to get satellite out into markets that have been more cost sensitive historically.
The subsidies would help, but also in the rural areas, it's less costly to deploy satellite broadband than fiber and cable.
Good point. In terms of being able to build out capacity, it's going to be something where being able to haul all that fiber or cable, certainly in terms of spanning the digital divide, maybe satellite is the way to go that way. Interesting to see where all of this happens to play out. I mean, there also are all these other use cases that keep kicking around. I mean, things like backhaul for telco. It does seem like satellite has the promise of being able to reach you wherever you are. The difficulty, I guess, is figuring out what you can do with the bandwidth and the capacity to be able to reach there. But maybe we get enough satellite constellations up there, we'll have more than enough capacity and be able to get at least a little closer to gigabit.
Maybe, but then that would mean so many satellites in space that you'd confuse them with stars.
Well, it seems like we're almost there now. I know there are a number of services that'll let you track Starlink satellite trains as they start to deploy. I guess we'll be seeing more of that as that goes forward, but I think a lot more light shining in the sky.
Right, yeah.
Well, thanks, Mal. This has been great. Appreciate all your feedback. It's been great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
There's so many questions about a lot of the capabilities that exist, but we are at time for this episode. That is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to the production team, including Sophie Carr, Feranmi Adeoshun, and Kyra Smith on the marketing and events teams. And our agency partner, the 199. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we'll be talking about M&A activity, mergers and acquisitions. We'll be coming back into a market that has had its own set of complexities. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.